What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review for Gothic 2. The sequel, of course, to the original Gothic, both of which being semi-open world RPGs from Piranha Bytes, who are known for a signature style of game, which we're about to break down and discuss here. Though because Gothic 2 is a direct sequel, I will be spoiling a good bit of Gothic 1, and while I'll definitely be spoiling a little bit about Gothic 2, we're definitely going to be talking about some of the main plot points of Gothic 1, which bears a mention. Though to kick this video off, I want to talk a little bit about the history of Gothic 2, because it's something of a cult classic, especially over in Europe along with all of the Gothic series. And if you're like myself, living in the United States or North America in general, while you've likely heard of this game, its cultural significance is much less. Which brings me to the history portion of this game, because I actually think the story behind Gothic 2 in particular and its release in North America explains a lot of its sort of lesser impact over here. So to start with, its developer Piranha Bytes has always been a relatively small developer. Relatively recently, in 2019, they were bought up by THQ Nordic, and even at that time, they only had like 30 employees. And their THQ Nordic acquisition I will double back to a little bit later, but for right now, let's talk about the release of Gothic 2. So originally, it was released in Germany in late 2002. It didn't see a release to the rest of the EU until about the middle of 2003, and it didn't see a North American launch until late 2003. But that's not even the full story there. While there was technically a release of this game to North America in 2003, it was largely without any sort of fanfare. There was basically no marketing push at all, meaning that most people weren't even aware of its launch. And it wasn't until towards the end of 2005 when the Gold Edition was published in North America, which included the expansion Night of the Raven, that it got a more significant release that actually was put out there into the open. But that's also significant because that means by the time North America really got a big Gothic 2 release, the time frame had largely come and gone. Oblivion released in 2006, Morrowind released back in 2002, Gothic 3 would release in 2006, and when you take a look at Gothic 2 and its sort of weird release in North America, I think it becomes pretty clear as to why this game just lacked a lot of that impact, because by the time most North Americans saw this game, it was very much so already old news. However, in spite of that, Gothic 2 did very well commercially speaking. Now, it didn't do outrageous sales numbers. We're talking like 400,000 copies in the first couple of years, but for a small company like Piranha Bytes, as well as an indie game more or less, it was still very much so commercially successful, and in many ways is seen as a large improvement over the original Gothic, which we'll discuss a bit more here soon. Though that brings us to the next part of this video, and that is simply getting the game running. Gothic 2, much like Gothic 1, really doesn't run on modern hardware without some adjustments being made. If you just buy this game and install it, it's likely not going to even start for you, which is where the community support for the title comes in. Though I would be remiss not to mention that outside of just mods and things to get the game running again, there is a lot of community support for the Gothic series overall, and you can find mods for days to change just about any aspect of this game on top of mods that overhaul it or are unto themselves almost entire games, such as the Chronicles of Myrtana mod that you'll hear about all the time. But let's talk about getting this game running. So relatively recently, because of Piranha Bytes' acquisition by THQ Nordic, they've been pushing to make their games a lot more accessible, at least in terms of their older ones, and they've been updating a lot of them to give them proper support. And this means for Steam in particular, adding beta branches for Steam Workshop support, which means mods directly on Steam, as well as releasing the original version of the game, that is to say without the expansion, as a beta branch as well, which was previously only accessible via a mod. Now, because of all this, you've got a pretty large variety of options when it comes to getting Gothic 2 running. The simplest way, if you're on Steam, would be to activate the Workshop beta branch, which will allow you to install mods for the title, then go to the community and download the Union patch, which will solve the vast majority of your problems and pretty much get it running right there. And if you do that, you can also subscribe to another mod called Gothic 2 Classic that will allow you to play the original version of the game. And a little bit later, we're going to be comparing and contrasting the classic version versus the Night of the Raven version, as they are very different and very relevant to this game, so I of course need to talk about it. But while it is great to have all of that support directly on Steam, you do still have a few other options that are arguably a bit easier. You can of course also buy the game over on GOG. I've heard mixed reports about this title working over there. I personally own it on Steam, and I was doing a little bit of research into the GOG version. As usually with older titles, they're the way to go, but from what I can tell, it's a bit of a mixed bag over there. It seems to work out of the box for some people, but not for others. So you're likely going to need mods for this version as well, which brings me to my personal recommendation, as well as the recommendation you'll often hear for this title, and that is actually the Spine mod manager. I'll try to drop a link to it down below, but Spine is incredibly easy to use because all you have to do is download it, show it where your Gothic installation is on your PC, and it will automatically install Union as well as a couple of other patches that make the game much more stable and usable on modern systems, while also providing you access to a large library of mods to pull from and install for you automatically. So if you're looking for ease of use, Spine is probably the way to go, but you can definitely get it done on the Steam Workshop as well. And in my personal opinion, I actually wound up using a combination of the two. I would use the Workshop support to download the Gothic 2 Classic mod while also using Spine. You can use one or the other, but I wound up using both, which was the easiest for me overall. So you have a few different options with how you want to tackle this, but it is important to note that the game is unlikely to run out of the box for you these days, as it does not play well with modern systems, but thankfully, due to dedicated community support, the game has seen its life extended by quite a bit. From here, I want to talk a little bit about the story setup for the title. Though we're not going to be getting into the major details of the plot, there are some important things I want to speak about. Now, as I mentioned, this is a direct sequel, and I mean direct. It picks up immediately after Gothic 1 ends, and our character, the nameless hero, has defeated the Sleeper. After doing this, the structure we were in collapses and you get trapped under rubble, only to be saved by Zardos, the necromancer from the first title that was helping you towards the end of it, teleports you out, saves you, and explains the story of the second game. In defeating the Sleeper, or banishing it more aptly, it had a moment to call out to more evil forces and call them to the island of Corinus, which is where the penal colony from the first game was on. Thus, the island is being attacked by orcs and dragons. Orcs have been a threat from the first game as well, and they play a bigger role in the second title here. The dragons are relatively new, but they are evil forces that were called directly by the Sleeper. Zardos gives us the task of going to the city of Corinus to speak with the paladins there to inform them that this evil is coming and that we need a special artifact that will allow you to defeat the dragons, thus allowing you to combat the threat. Now that's the overall plot setup and mostly what you get told within the first few minutes of the game, but I do want to share some thoughts about the story overall here. For starters, the plot is a bit more generic than the original title. So in Gothic 1, you're thrown into this penal colony that's surrounded by a magic barrier and being forced to mine for ore that is magical in nature, so the king can use it to fight off a horde of orcs that is attacking the human kingdom on the mainland. Now this setup adds a lot of very unique elements to Gothic 1. It feels very strange. You're in this penal colony, you're trading ore instead of gold. The weird situation under the barrier has caused interesting social structures around camps to pop up, whereas Gothic 2 tends to go for a bit more of a generic story where it is good guy fighting against evil. There's dragons involved. It just feels much more generic fantasy than the first title ever did. And while the story overall is still pretty decent, it just comes across feeling a little more stereotypical than the first game. That's not to say it's without its moments though. Much like the previous title, it uses a chapter setup, and as the chapters progress, that is to say you move from one chapter to another, things change in the world, monsters respawn, that kind of thing. But I think they still did some interesting things with the story elements here. For starters, there is a couple chapters where you're directed to sort of stealth around large orc camps, that is to say avoid engaging them directly, as you will very likely die as a result, as you simply won't have the stats to take them on, outside of slowly picking them off one by one where applicable. So in things like that, the story does try to do a few new things compared to the original Gothic that I think mostly landed pretty well. That's just one instance of the game trying to diversify the quests and things that it gives you, and I think in that way it mostly succeeded, especially when we start looking at other parts of the narrative, such as which faction you join, influencing how you interact with the story a little bit. As despite the pressing threat, there are certain political machinations between various factions expansions on the island, which we'll talk about, that are causing other pressures outside of the more imminent threat of the orcs and the dragons. All of which culminates as you sort of gather the allies you've made, which is highly variable, to then sort of storm the last dungeon and fight the forces of evil. Overall though, it's a pretty well done story, even if it does lean a bit on the generic side. Now from here I want to talk about some of the differences between the classic version and the Night of the Raven version, which largely comes down to additional content from the expansion of course, as well as the rebalancing of most of the game. So classic is generally regarded as easier, which I would say is largely true. I played through both, but this is because the amount of experience and things like that available to you throughout the course of the game are much more abundant than they will be in Night of the Raven. Because in the base game, you can actually max out a significant amount of stats, especially if you're trying to min-max, but even if you're not, you'll likely wind up in a very strong position along the power curve typical to Piranha Bytes games where you start out very weak but get very overpowered at the end. And while that power curve is still there for both of these versions of the game, in Classic, you'll get there much faster than you will in Night of the Raven, which largely comes down to the expansion's redistribution, or changes, if you will, to the way stats are spread and acquired. Now, because of this, Night of the Raven is a little bit more difficult because it really awards player knowledge and knowing how to min-max a character. You can certainly get through it if it's your first time, but it's gonna be probably a worse experience for newcomers, as opposed to likely a better experience overall for veterans who already know how the game works, because they'll know what to do in terms of how to min-max, at least to the extent that is required. Because while I wouldn't say you need to min-max a character on Night of the Raven, you do definitely need to be making a coherent build that is focusing on a specific thing, which is largely down to the increasing costs of training, which we'll talk about in just a second. Now, the other part of Night of the Raven is that the content from the expansion is not optional. You will get to a point where in order to progress the story, you have to complete the content from Night of the Raven, which I imagine is in part to sort of counterbalance the increased cost to all of the stats and everything. That way they make sure you actually get the experience that you're going to need later in the game. Luckily though, the Night of the Raven content is pretty good. It can feel a little detached from the rest of the game because of the way it's implemented, with you loading into a separate area, but a lot of the content there is really cool. You get to join a band of pirates, you get to investigate a bunch of missing people, there's an attempted murder you can solve, as well as a lot of various ways you can complete various objectives to ultimately track down the leader of the bandits that were also freed from the penal colony when you brought down the barrier, which ties into the main story in a way I don't want to ruin, but ultimately you're fighting a guy named Raven who has sworn himself to evil. But in all seriousness though, the Night of the Raven expansion is really cool overall, and it adds a ton of content to the game. It probably, I would say, doubles the content in each of the first 3 chapters of the game, which is about the first half. So if you choose to skip Night of the Raven and only play Classic, you will be missing out on a significant amount of content. That though brings us to the progression systems portion of the video, and this works largely the way it did in Gothic 1, no real surprises here. Your first level up will cost you 500 experience, and every subsequent level will cost an increasing 500, so the first level is 500, the second's 1,000, which is pretty standard. The more impactful part of this though, as level ups are mostly just going to be granting you extra health, is how you choose to spend the learning points that you're earning with every level up. Every level up you'll get 10 learning points that you then need to find a trainer to help you distribute across strength or dexterity, various weapon skills, as well as just regular skills. Now your attributes, strength and dexterity plus various weapon skills, one-handed, two-handed, bows and crossbows, will increase your damage with those things, with weapon training allowing you to perform more combos with that weapon. Just like in Gothic 1, the higher your weapon skill, the bigger combos you can pull off, which is a sort of rhythm game where you have to click attack again at sort of the end of the initial attack to perform various combos, at least as far as the melee weapons go. Now, unlike the first game, the trainers don't really tell you about this, so it feels a little less impactful as far as your character learning to do the thing, but I think that's mostly fine for a sequel. You can also train to increase your mana, which will allow you to cast more spells, which is especially important if you go the magic route via the Fire Magicians faction. However, even using things like scrolls costs mana, so while it's not essential for a lot of characters, you might want a little bit of mana But then we have various other skills. Now we see the return of sneak and pickpocketing, which will sort of give you some alternative quest solutions. Pickpocketing in particular can be a little difficult to track down because you have to find the Thieves Guild, which has the only trainer for pickpocketing in the game. But having pickpocket and a high dexterity can, again, just open up some easier quest solutions by allowing you to just pickpocket things off of people. So if you're going for a dex-based character, that can be a pretty fun way to go. But then we have more sort of crafting-oriented skills, which is to say forging weapons, alchemy, and creating runes. Alchemy is pretty much useful no matter what you're doing. However, the other ones, such as forging weapons and creating runes, are kind of useful in various situational instances. So forging weapons allows you to, of course, forge weapons, which is mostly just okay. You're never really going to be hurting for weapons or anything, and the weapons you make aren't the most amazing weapons, even once you train up the ability to do it. So it's an option, I suppose, but I never really found a lot of use for it. Creating runes is more down to the fire magicians. So in order to learn magic in this game, unlike previous games, you can't just buy the runes, you have to make them yourself, which means if you want to go the magic route and you don't want to use just scrolls, you have to learn how to create runes that will then allow you to craft the permanent versions of those spells that you can then use, provided you also have the necessary circle of magic learned, that is to say levels of spells, which makes magic a bit more of a dedicated build as opposed to something you can just augment other builds with, like you did in Gothic 1. Then we have alchemy. Alchemy is pretty universally useful. Gothic 2 has a lot of items that will just give you permanent increases to your stats, a lot of which can be enhanced through alchemy. So if you find plants and things that increase stats, you can, if you find the appropriate recipe, make a potion that increases them even farther, which is useful for min-maxing. And then last but not least, we have the animal trophies. This will allow you to get extra reagents from animals, which can be helpful for alchemy, but also just as a method of gaining money as you can sell these trophies. Though I would say gold was never a problem in Gothic 2 for me. If anything, I had an overabundance pretty much all the time. So when it comes to progression in Gothic 2, a lot of it just comes down to prioritizing what you want to do very specifically and finding trainers to help you do exactly that. But this is where it gets a little tricky, especially with Knight of the Raven. In the classic version, this is mostly just a one-for-one system, outside of a couple instances with the weapon types. In Gothic 2, however, there's a sort of cost increase as you start to level up your stats. So like 1 through 30 will be a one-for-one learning point to skill point. However, after that, it starts increasing in cost, up to a maximum of like 5 points for 1 point once you hit about level 120 for that individual skill, attribute, etc. Now the base game, the classic version, really only went up to level 100 anyway, before trainers would stop being able to train you, though you could still take items and things and progress that even farther. Knight of the Raven sort of rescaled that, as well as the requirements for a lot of weapons, etc., to allow a lot of your skills and everything to go up to 200, which the game has been rebalanced around, which is one of the reasons that the min-maxing becomes more necessary on Knight of the Raven. So certainly something to keep in mind. From there, though, I want to talk about a few of the factions you can join. There are 3 primary ones for the main story, and a couple of other smaller ones. Though the 3 main story factions are the Militia/Paladins, the Mercenaries/Dragon Hunters, and then the Fire Magicians. Joining each one of these is an impactful choice. Progression-wise, because you need their equipment. Armor, in particular, is a big part of Piranha Bytes games, and usually in order to get decent armor, you have to join a faction, and the damage reduction afforded by good armor is largely what's going to allow you to actually fight enemies without dying incredibly quickly. So you're going to want to pick and join a faction relatively quickly, but each of them do different things. Joining the Militia is more standard fighter stuff, but will also give you the option to join the Paladins later, which get their own special Paladin magic, which was really fun to use, by the way, as they get a Harm Evil spell that is an absolute nuke in the late game, and I had a lot of fun using that one. The Mercenaries and the Dragon Hunters tend to be more dex-based ranged fighters who are at political odds with the Paladins. The Paladins are sort of law and order, whereas the Mercenaries have sided with some sort of separatist farmers out in the countryside who are tired of giving everything they've got to the king in the war effort. Joining the Mercenaries allows you to join the Dragon Hunters later, which are honestly just pretty cool. But then finally we have the Fire Magicians. This is your mage option. So if you want to use dedicated spell casting, you're going to need to join the Fire Magicians. as that's how you'll learn to create runes as well as increase your circle of magic, which will allow you to do more than just use scrolls or paladin magic. The fire magicians themselves sort of work alongside the paladins. They're just a slightly different branch of the same faction, if that makes sense. They work together very closely. But all of these factions and the choices they're in, just in terms of the builds available to you as well as what they do for the story, gives you a lot of potential for replayability just right there. But there are also a couple of minor factions I want to mention, and these are the Thieves Guild and the Ring of Water. The Ring of Water is specifically for the Knight of the Raven. It's a sort of secret society that helps out the water magicians, which are a big part of the Knight of the Raven expansion. And this is in addition to whatever faction you already join. So you'll join the Ring of Water in addition to your regular faction. They'll give you some armor and things like that, as well as some items too. But then we have the Thieves Guild, a sort of optional faction, if you will, that you can choose to either join or destroy, presuming you find them at all. They are very much so missable, but in the city of Corinus, you can track down the Thieves Guild, which is mandatory if you want to learn how to pickpocket. And they can provide you some extra quests, and how you choose to deal with them is up to you. It's relatively minor, but it's a nice touch. All of that, though, brings us to the world section. Now, as I mentioned, overall, I would say this game is a bit more generic than the original title. However, it's still pretty good. For instance, we get a lot more exploration of themes that were brought up in the original Gothic. That is to say, the gods of the world, Innos, Adanos, and Beliar, which is basically the gods of justice, balance, and evil, respectively, who all play a pretty prominent role in this title. In addition to this, we also get more background information on sort of the political happenings with the King of Myrtana and how his war against the orcs is going on the mainland, and we see some of that play out in the tensions between the farmers and the paladins on the island, as the paladins have largely just been commandeering anything and everything they need, leaving the farmers, the people actually working for it, with basically nothing in some instances. We also see the consequences of our own actions, from tearing down the magical barrier that was keeping everyone in the penal colony, as some of the people working there were legitimately bandits and get right back to their banditry after we let them out after the ending of the first game. Combine that with talking to all sorts of returning characters from the original as well, and I think Gothic 2 does a really good job of fleshing out some of the important bits of the Gothic universe, while at the same time carrying the story forward. And because of those elements, I'm willing to forgive the story itself for being a bit more generic fantasy than the original title was. Because while that is true, they at the same time carried forward and expanded upon all these elements in a way that felt really natural and authentic to the setting at the same time. From there, though, let's talk combat a little bit. We got melee, ranged, and magic. This is mostly the same as it was in Gothic 1, just with some minor changes. For starters, it feels a little bit nicer to play, though the core of it is largely the same. Melee is very straightforward. You run up to enemies, you hit them, try to pull off combos like I mentioned earlier. Combos you will learn by increasing your weapon skill, though it is worth mentioning that a lot of humanoid enemies will actually block you in this title, which you can also do by pressing the attack button as well as the back button. You can perform a sort of block action with your weapon, though it's a little harder for you to pull off. And I mention this in particular because orcs' propensity to block is very high, making them difficult to deal with in groups when you first encounter them, and learning when to attack them so they're unlikely to block you is a big part of melee combat, as I found out with my first run. Then we have ranged. If you, in my opinion, want to pick the most overpowered way to go, I think it is really ranged. If you combine the ranged combat with the min-maxing that is available to you, I think it gets overpowered very, very quickly, to the point where you just look at things, click attack, and they're dying. Now, the downside here is that you do actually have ammunition you need to keep track of, and it takes a second to swap to your melee weapon if things actually manage to get close to you, which can be a little bit of a balancing act at the beginning, but by far and away, I really felt like ranged combat, due to its reliance really only being on ammunition that is cheap and plentiful, made for the easiest way to go in terms of combat. Then we have magic. Magic can certainly be a lot of fun. There's summons you can make use of. There are various damaging abilities you can use. It feels a little reined in from the original Gothic, but I think that's mostly down to the restrictions placed on when you get access to it. As you have to join one faction, you have to learn to create runes, you have to create most of those runes yourself. I think there's a few you can find, but for the most part, you're going to have to create your own runes. And as such, magic is a little more inaccessible, because even if you go the power paladin route, the magic you get access to is very specifically paladin magic that you have to be a paladin to use, and even then it's only a handful of spells. So while magic is great and it's very strong late game, it's a little more difficult to get into unless you play directly into that, which combined with some of the rebalancing added by Knight of the Raven, I think made it even more inaccessible. But if you're willing to put in the work to build a mage character, it can be very fun. Though I would tell you the paladin magic gets some really great offensive spells that were really funny to use, and is frankly a little easier to get your hands on. So all in all, combat is largely a mostly clunky experience just like the first game. But there are some improvements to be had, and it is an enjoyable experience if you're willing to learn how a lot of it works. But as I'm sure you've seen on screen, it's not exactly a modern experience by any stretch of the imagination, but it still can certainly be fun. Just understand that it's mostly a product of your stats and your equipment, and learning how to time melee attacks. From there though, let's talk about Steam Deck compatibility. Much like Gothic 1, I'm unable to show you Steam Deck footage because for whatever reason, recording software just freaks the games of Gothic 1 and 2 out on the Steam Deck, but I was able to get it running, and just like the PC versions, you need to install the mods and everything to make that happen, but it is very playable. The only issue I really ran into was needing to use the Steam Deck's keyboard to enter something for the saves, as well as adjusting the controller layout. There are several default community layouts that people have already made and worked on for the Steam Deck, which means you'll likely just choose one of those and then get used to the controls, which can be a little bit wonky because this game wasn't exactly made with a controller in mind. But once you get used to it, it's a pretty enjoyable experience on Steam Deck that runs a lot better than I thought it was going to. That though brings us to our positives and negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, you have a ton of options for role playing. You've got all this replayability with the factions, the Knight of the Raven content, all of the different approaches to combat itself. There's just a lot to be had in Gothic 2, a lot of which is improved upon from the first title, so it really feels like the best possible experience in terms of Gothic 1's mechanics being improved, which combined with the story things I mentioned earlier and the expansions made to the universe of Gothic makes for overall a really great sequel. Now, on the negative side of things, we do have quite a few though. Honestly, as this game is getting on in age, it's becoming more clunky and difficult to play. Just getting it running is going to require some work on your end that some people just aren't going to want to deal with. The story is a bit more generic than the original title as well. And I would say the difficulty added by Knight of the Raven being largely aimed at people who had played the game before can also be a deterrent to newcomers, which combined with the requirement to get the mods and everything to get the game running, makes this a hard sell for people to check out, which is likely why a lot of people are watching this video instead. Which brings me to my conclusion. Gothic 2 is a great game, it's a great sequel, provided you can be persuaded to get past the barrier to entry, which is relatively high, especially by today's standards. Now luckily though, on the flip side of that, the game is almost comically cheap. While I believe technically its full price is around $10, you can regularly find it on sale for next to nothing. I bought the entire Gothic and Risen series for less than $10. They were about $1 a piece. So while you might have to put a little work into getting them running, they are extraordinarily cheap, especially on sale, which I think is good because if you're willing to put in the effort to play Gothic 2, there is a great game here with a really interesting world that manages to be a great sequel to the original title, and with all of the community support over the years, the mods you can play, the overhaul mods, there's so much you can do with this title, provided, again, you can get past that barrier to entry, which is why I definitely think this title is worth checking out for yourself, as I enjoyed it immensely, albeit with a little bit of frustration here and there due to some of the age and clunkiness associated with the title. That said though, next we'll be moving on to Gothic 3, which has not been loved quite as much by the community. From what I understand, Gothic 3 is generally regarded as a bit worse, or the worst in the trilogy at the very least. But nonetheless, we will be checking that one out for completeness sake eventually. But realistically, I imagine that the Gothic title people will likely play for the first time these days is the Gothic 1 remake that is supposed to be in development. And if we ever see that actually released, I will also be playing that one for sure, as I'm very curious to see what they wind up doing with the world of Gothic 1 with that remake. But that is going to do it for today. That has been my retrospective review of Gothic 2. A truly great classic game. So with all of that said, I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.